Welcome to Live.Work.Thrive. I'm Michaela Birmingham, Scary Mommy Executive Producer. And tonight we are talking about why moms love murder. We are going to decode our true crime obsession. Why? Because it's Halloween and because there's no good news to be had out there. So let's just go all in on murder, shall we? Right? Taking a break from COVID, talk about murder. All right. So, we like to go big on Live.Work.Thrive. Tonight, we are joined by some of true crime's top experts, including two incredible podcast hosts who will tell us why they keep telling horrible stories. Specifically, tonight's discussion will cover why more women than men are attracted to true crime shows, the lack of representation of marginalized voices in the true crime genre, when does our obsession with crime shift from entertainment to exploitation, and of course, we will be taking your questions throughout the show, so hit them up wherever you're watching. Let's meet our panelists. With us tonight is Yeardley Smith, an Emmy Award-winning actress, novelist, and playwright who has appeared on television, film, and Broadway. She's been the voice of Lisa Simpson on Fox's hit television show The Simpsons since 1987. Yeardley also co-hosts and co-produced the hit true crime podcast, Small Town Dicks. Thank you so much for being with us, Yeardley.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
And also with us is Madeleine Baran, who is the host and lead reporter of the APM podcast In the Dark. Her award-winning reporting has exposed racial discrimination by prosecutors, a decades-long cover-up of clergy sexual abuse, and unchecked violence in state-run mental health institutions. Madeleine, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Later in the show, we will also hear from Dr. Jean Murley, who is a professor of English at Queensborough Community College in New York. Dr. Murley is an acclaimed true crime expert, and her book, The Rise of True Crime, 20th Century Murder and American Popular Culture, is an analysis of both the historical development and the current forms of the genre. Along with her, we will hear from Dr. Amanda Vickery, who is a professor and chair of the psychology department at Illinois Wesleyan University in Bloomington, Illinois. She has published research on women's interest in true crime and is an avid true crime fan herself. Before we get started, I have a few quick reminders for everyone out there watching. Like I said, you can submit your questions in the comments on all the platforms, and we may feature your question later on in the show, so stick with us. Also, join our mailing list so you don't miss any of our upcoming events. Visit scarymommy.com/liveworkthrive to catch up and stay in touch. And I just want to make a special plug out there. If you are a parent and you missed last week's show, it's saved in our library, and it is the best source of info on the COVID-19 vaccine for children, which is now in the final stages of being authorized. Please learn about it from the experts. We've had the president of the Academy of Pediatrics on talking about the vaccine. Great place to get the facts, maybe not your cousin's sister's friend. All right, just going to say that. Okay, so let's get into tonight's topic. Let's talk about the attraction here, because, we've heard, and, some of our experts will speak to this as well. Women are, in particular, over men, attracted to the true crime genre. Madeleine, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting, hearing people who study this and what they say. I mean, about, women being, more likely to be victims of certain kinds of violent crime. And so having an interest in these stories, some would say because they have no choice but to be interested in these stories, or, thinking about themselves, perhaps being in some of these situations. I think a lot about that with stories about domestic violence in particular, which is so common. And so many, of these murders where people are killed by their significant other. And so I think, unfortunately, sometimes when you're listening to some of these stories, you're seeing yourself or someone in those stories.
That is so true. And Yeardley, how did you get into the true crime world yourself? What drew you to it?
I was always really interested in true crime, but I just, sort of casually, as we're watching ID Discovery and all those shows on TV, and then I co-host my podcast Small Town Dicks with identical twin detectives who we call Detective Dan and Detective Dave. And the way that all came about was I was Detective Dan. I was at a Simpsons event because I do the voice of Lisa Simpson, obviously. And Detective Dan was my security. He was my off-duty cop to make sure that, I didn't get kidnapped or something.
Can't have
And,
Lisa Simpson go down.
You
Then
can't
what's
have
left?
that.
No.
That would be a national nightmare.
No,
For,
that would be
you know,
too much.
Too
Too
much.
much right now.
Too
We
much.
can't have a pandemic and lose Lisa.
And lose Lisa Simpson. So that was in 2014. And we started dating. And so the way the podcast came about was that, and we lived in different states. So I would go north to see Dan about every other weekend. And when I would go, his twin brother would come over and they would download their Tuesday, their Wednesday, their Thursday, and your hair would be on fire. And so it was clear that ought to be a podcast, but also that those stories ought to be told by the detectives who investigated those cases. Not told to me, and then I would retell them to you, even though I was the more well-known person. It was obvious it should come from the source.
That's so interesting. So we're going to hear in a second from Professor Vickery, who has studied how women consume true crime. And she actually has data to support that this is not, just an anecdotal theory. It's actually backed up and supported by her data. She's studied thousands of women and their preferences. And she's found that we actually do like to consume true crime more than men. Here she is explaining her findings.
I'm Amanda Vickery. I'm a professor of social psychology and the chair of the psychology department at Illinois Wesleyan University in Bloomington, Illinois. Women are more into true crime than men. Studies have shown that. My own studies have shown that. And what I found, and I assessed thousands of women, asking them to choose between different elements of crime stories, what they wanted to read about, et cetera. What women were drawn to were stories that contained the psychological content of the killer. So what set him off, what was his upbringing like, and also stories where the victim escaped somehow. Did they use some clever trick they used off the internet or some sort of psychological manipulation? Women were into these things. And when you step back and look at them, they're related to survival, right? How do I avoid the dangerous boyfriend? What warning signs do I look for? How do I escape if I'm put in the trunk of a car or something like that? And so I think if you ask women, why are you into true crime? Most of them aren't going to say, oh, I'm learning survival skills or something like that. But my research shows that that's really what they're drawn to. And we know women, compared to men, have a heightened fear of crime. And I think that's what's driving a lot of people to these stories, even if they don't realize it.
So this is so fascinating to me because as a mom, when you have kids, Madeleine's right now at her sister's house. It's toddler bedtime, right? So generally speaking, at this stage in our lives, we're not going out alone as much. We're almost never alone, sadly. I would pay money to be in a pantry alone, on most nights of the week. We're not dating anymore. The chances of encountering a Ted Bundy type of dude drop significantly. Of course, yes, there are, women with children who are murdered and abducted and all of those horrible things. But I feel like at this stage in life, the chances are going down. What scenarios are we trying to protect ourselves from by consuming all these things? If her theory is right, women are listening to these things and thinking, okay, I got to decode the guy that seems off. I say guy because it's usually a guy. Who is it that we're trying to protect ourselves from exactly? The shady cashier at Trader Joe's? Or maybe my life is just really boring and I need to spice it up with more potential murdering men. But Madeleine, what do you think? The serial killer rates are relatively low, but we still, we're drawn into those stories. And, there is this, subconscious level that, Professor Vickery is saying that we're trying to protect ourselves by learning these profiles. What do you think?
Gosh, honestly, I am someone who would never consume that. I'm someone who, really cannot watch a horror movie, even a horror movie that people say is not really a horror movie. It's actually more funny than scary. I'm no, it will be a horror movie to me. So I don't know if I'm the right person to ask. I think that, there are things that are, certain extremes, for me as an investigative reporter, sort of seeing the extremes that can happen in certain cases can be illuminating of a whole societal structure. For example, we know the government is powerful, but we really see that in a death penalty case where the government has the power to kill someone. We know that police are supposed to be solving crime. We don't pay attention to that probably very much when our bike is stolen, but in a high profile serial killer case where no one can catch the person who did it, we are really paying attention to that. So I think sometimes even if, for whatever reason we come to these issues, they can help us look at larger things that are happening. And for me as an investigative reporter, like that's what I'm interested in, is like, where is the system breaking down?
Where is it breaking down? That's so true. And Yeardley, you're coming to it a little bit from a different perspective because you're facilitating this conversation with folks who are, on law enforcement, who, are also not drawn to this for, entertainment reasons. It's their job, right? They're coming there and telling you all of these details as part of what they do every day.
I think for me, as I was listening to Dr. Vickery and to Madeleine, I also think that women are gatherers of emotional intelligence, of that kind of, nuanced behavior. So even if you're not thinking, is my Trader Joe's checkout guy a serial killer on his, day off? I think that we're always, as human beings, but perhaps particularly as women, picking up subtle cues, body language, a tone of voice, something to inform, is this person with me? Are they not with me? Do they like me? I'm not sure if they like me. No matter how, unless you're super secure, I think that we're always reading signs. And
that is such a good point.
In my podcast, I'm the layperson at the table. So I ask all the questions that you would ask if you had a chance to sit at that table. So I always want to know, why does this suspect that we've been talking about, why do they do what they do? And then you as the detective, why do you do what you do and how do you do it?
That is so interesting.
Just want to know the personal side of what makes people tick.
Totally. And I think you're so right about emotional intelligence. I think that is one of the most underrated qualities these days, especially in, just even in like the workplace, like when you have the ability to sense, the way another person's feeling or, what their motivations are, it can really go a long way. And I imagine, Madeleine, you must encounter this as well when you're interviewing people and you've got to kind of decide and win them over in some cases to trust you, right? To be able to talk in situations where it seems like, in listening to your show, a lot of times people are not always so enthusiastic about talking.
They never want to talk to Madeleine,
but they do.
She's so good at it.
I'm like, you show up at the door and you're like, hi, and then next thing you know, the person's letting you in the house. Like, I mean, you must be a master at emotional intelligence.
I mean, I think a lot about, whenever I'm going to talk to someone, why in the world would someone talk to a reporter? It doesn't really make sense to do sometimes. Other times it makes a lot of sense. But, and the answer is different for everybody. For some people, it's that, it's some like high level motivation. I want justice to be served, or I want this wrong to be righted, or whatever. A lot of times, honestly, it's just that like I am bored and no one ever listens to me. Like not about a case or a story, like in my life, and I think that when you show up at someone's house or call them on the phone and you're genuinely interested in listening to what they have to say, and you show that and they believe that because it's true, and you're open to wherever the conversation goes, you're not like coming in saying like, I know what happened and I need to ask you these 3 questions to confirm that I'm right, that a lot of times people want to talk. I mean, that to me has been the case more than not. And I think sometimes it's just like, how many people do you have in your life who will literally listen to you for like as long as you want, hours, 4 hours, 5 hours? I mean, a lot of the interviews, when you hear on our show, it's obviously you're not listening to somebody talk for 2 hours. You're not even listening to them talk for 15 minutes usually. But a lot of our interviews are really long. And so people just, I think, want to talk a lot of times, and even sometimes about really painful things, people want to talk. And so I always want to leave that in a responsible way, open to the person to decide how far they want to go. But yeah, I think that, we've on our whole team, because it's not just me, it's a team of 4 other people full time on In the Dark, do a lot of thinking in advance too. Like, how can I build trust? For season 2, we moved to Mississippi, lived there for nearly a year, and we really embedded ourselves in the community there. And we're invited to all kinds of things like Friday night football games, church on Sunday, community cleanup day. We hung out in the courtroom, just so people would be like, oh yeah, like I may not know who these public radio people are that are in my small town, but I like had seen them around. And it actually got to the point by like towards the end of our reporting, like we'd been there for so long, when we would knock on someone's door, they would be like, well, I was wondering when you would come talk to me. Like, why didn't you talk to me? You talked to everyone else. Like, you talked to my neighbor, you talked to my kid's babysitter, you talked to the high school football coach. Like, why not me? Like, I've literally watched you interview my neighbor from inside my bedroom or whatever. It's like across the street or whatever. So, there are different ways of building trust too. And one of them is just being around, like not exactly being a stranger.
That's so great to hear that you really, embraced and embedded yourself in those communities. So, I mean, I think your work, shows the depth of journalistic reporting and how that, journalism can be then translated into a podcast for a general audience. And now in the true crime genre itself, there's a huge range of, levels of, let's call it depth, in these different, whether it's a podcast or a show on, a streaming network. And one of the most popular true crime podcasts out there is called My Favorite Murder. Some of you guys, if you're watching right now and you're a fan of MFM, let us know in the comments. Some love it. Some have issues with the format. More on that debate later. But one thing that I think is a little bit interesting about our conversation about women and why we like this, one of the things that the hosts of that show, Georgia Hardstark and Karen Kilgariff, use is the phrase F politeness. And they describe how women have been kind of socialized to be polite. And, sometimes if we feel uneasy in a situation, we worry about being rude and leaving or saying no when it's, you're expected to just go along with things. So I'm curious, Yeardley, do you think that these types of survivor stories are in a way empowering women and maybe educating us a little bit to abandon these societal norms of politeness and just, keep ourselves safe?
Well, in the best possible way, yes, hopefully, that you feel empowered to defend yourself however that needs to happen. So the detectives on my podcast, Dan and Dave, will always say, when we get questions from listeners, fight like hell, like just scream your head off, use if you have fingernails, if you happen to have keys in your hand, whatever it is, fight like it's your last fight. Take no prisoners. And so if I think in listening to these stories, women feel like, okay, I'm going to cast off the things, everything that I was taught about being proper, then that is the scenario I think absolutely 100% appropriate. I don't think it's going to lead to women suddenly just, sort of being rude and I don't know what, sort of casting off all societal norms in every situation. I don't think we have to worry about that in case that's a worry. But I think we learn from experiences, right? And in some cases, you hope you never have that experience. But you still log that information.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit, again, to what you were saying about when you feel that feeling in the pit of your stomach where like, oh, something's off here. I'm just going to get up from the dinner table on this weird Tinder date that I'm on and just say, I got to go. Like, absolutely. I don't have a reason. I got to go. Yes. Like, I feel like that is something that we've been sort of socialized to not do, maybe. But, hearing these stories and hearing how women are like, yeah, I had a bad feeling and I just went home. And then the next day they read in the paper that the person who they always were, a little concerned about was the one who did all the terrible things, right?
Yes.
So Madeleine, let's talk about, the past year and a half, we've had, an awakening, so to speak, on police brutality. Many true crime podcasts are now, taking a closer look at the role of law enforcement in doing justice, or in some case, playing a role in injustice, as, you've shown us in your stories. Can you tell us more about how your show In the Dark played a role in the outcome of the Curtis Flowers case?
Yeah, so Curtis Flowers is a man in Mississippi, a Black man in Mississippi, grew up in a really small town called Winona, Mississippi. And in 1996, 4 people were shot to death in a small town furniture store, like on a weekday morning, and no one saw it happen. And there was no DNA. There's no great evidence in the case. And Curtis had actually worked at that store for just a couple of days earlier that summer. And a couple months later, he was arrested and charged and went on trial for the murders of 4 people. He always said that he didn't do it. The evidence against him was basically circumstantial, plus a series of jailhouse informants who said Curtis confessed to him. But the unique thing about Curtis Flowers' case is that, so he was put on trial before an all-white jury. He was tried, he was convicted, he was sentenced to death. He appealed, he won his appeal. He was put back on trial, same prosecutor, again, found guilty, again, sentenced to death. Again, he appeals, wins his appeal because the prosecutor committed misconduct, and it happens again. And so, but the point that which we found out about Curtis Flowers' case, he had been tried 6 times for this crime, and he was sitting on death row in Mississippi. And so we spent by the end of it, several years, but I moved to Mississippi with a team. We lived there for nearly a year. We investigated the prosecutor, basically. I mean, it really wasn't an investigation of the crime. It was an investigation of what had happened in this case. Our question was, why has he been tried 6 times for the same crime? And in the process of doing that, we looked at all the evidence, and the evidence really didn't hold up to scrutiny. So witnesses told us that, yes, they testified to seeing him walk, in the direction of the furniture store that morning, but that they had felt intimidated by law enforcement. Or in the biggest example, the jailhouse informant told us that he made up that story, that Curtis Flowers never confessed to him. And so we did all this reporting. We released a reporting. We also looked at what was happening in jury selection, where the prosecutor was striking Black prospective jurors from the jury over and over again, and getting caught a lot of times for doing it intentionally, which is against the Constitution and is part of the reason why Curtis kept winning his appeals. So we put out our reporting, and then this really surprising thing happened that I didn't expect to have happen. I don't know anyone who expected it to happen. It almost never happens, which is that Curtis was granted, his petition to the US Supreme Court was granted. So they heard his case. And so then we went to the Supreme Court and heard oral arguments in the case, and the Supreme Court overturned his conviction. And then a couple months later, he walks out of jail in Mississippi, and he's free. He's out now. Is just living his life.
And so do you think it was because, the rise of popularity of your show and people were, listening to these details? I mean, you're sitting there listening to the guy who was like, yeah, I wanted $30,000. So I made up a story that he confessed to me in jail because I really wanted some new clothes and a new car.
Right.
I mean, did people tell you that, yes, you were the difference there in this case?
I mean, we don't know. We don't know why the Supreme Court, when they decide to hear a case, they don't say why. And so exactly. So we don't know. But I think that I know that our reporting was definitely mentioned. It was in court when it was mentioned at the bail hearing for Curtis to get out, back when the case wasn't sure what was going to happen after the Supreme Court reversed, where they weren't sure if they were going to try him again. And so I know that mattered. That mattered with the judge. And it was the same judge from 2 of the trials who was hearing all this stuff for the first time. So the judge seemed very not happy to learn that, he was told certain things in his courtroom that weren't true. I mean, he seemed to be almost personally offended by that he had presided over a trial in which certain things that he thought were true turned out to not be true. And he was the person who granted Curtis bail. There was also, Curtis had a legal team that was, talking really about, what it came down to was about the decision to overturn it or not came down to what was happening in jury selection and this racial discrimination in jury selection. I think we did a lot of examination of that, but I think where Curtis didn't get retried again has a lot to do with the fact that there isn't good evidence that Curtis committed this crime. And really, there is no evidence that stands up to scrutiny that ties him to this crime. So I think it was probably both, but also the reality is that there are other, presumably, unfortunately, Curtis Flowers in the world, people who are sitting on death row with very little evidence connecting them to a crime. And the chances that they would run this gauntlet, when everything has to be going a certain way to get out, Curtis was going to be executed. And he's, and so it's he really, this almost never happens. We didn't even have a plan for this to happen. We plan on every last thing that can happen in a story. We didn't bother planning for this because this just doesn't happen. And so I just think for as exciting as it is for Curtis and important, obviously, as it is for Curtis and for his family, it's also depressing to think about all of the other people who are going to have a really hard time. It could have gone, any way for Curtis, and it's kind of surprising it went the way it did. Interestingly, the guy who moved into Curtis's cell on death row in Parchman Prison in Mississippi, the guy who's literally in his bed, also says that he's innocent and that he didn't commit the crime. And there's also some questions about that. Anyways, so it just shows you how common, unfortunately, this problem is.
Wow. Yes. I mean, if you haven't listened to this show, please buckle up because it's intense. But I think, what you're describing is very much in line with some of the analysis that one of the true crime experts that we spoke to had to say about this idea of hearing stories of injustice and, misconduct and things like that can be in some way inspiring to the public to really want to take action when we hear these stories about the ways that our criminal justice system is flawed. In the case of Curtis Flowers, clearly it was a situation of systemic racism, no doubt. So I want to go now to Dr. Murley, who's going to talk a little bit about what she has seen with these situations where you have potentially internet sleuths and others who are shedding light on some of the stories that don't often get heard. Here she is.
I am Dr. Jean Murley. I am a professor of English at Queensborough Community College in New York City. Our systems of law enforcement and criminal justice are inadequate in many, many ways, particularly when it comes to marginalized victims who are largely, of course, women. And there's a kind of an acknowledgement on the part of these online sleuths. They may not say it out loud, but there's certainly something going on around the fact that certain types of victims' cases are not given the resources that others are, right? And you see this with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children projects that have sort of proliferated, right? That Indigenous women are many, many more times likely to be victims of domestic violence and murder and abduction and sexual assault than white women are, or any other minority group, frankly. There's that part of it, right? That people are sort of realizing that law enforcement agencies don't always have the resources, the time, the will to investigate cases in the ways that they should be investigated. And I think that can be a really good thing, that people are doing these really in-depth investigations and producing results in some cases.
Get a lot of feedback and emails from whether they be detectives or police officers themselves who have listened to your show. And what do they say? What are some of the comments that you get back from that community?
We get sort of the whole gamut. A lot of times they write in and say they've learned so much from listening to these other investigators about, I mean, they're not always specific about what specifically they learned, but they've learned from hearing how these other cases were investigated. They also say, thank you for shining a good light on law enforcement in this day and age while we have this really important conversation about police brutality, police abuse of power in this country, police reform. And, but it's interesting, I don't know, you don't think of a detective listening to a podcast and going, oh, wow, all right, I'm going to put that in my little bag of, goodies. So it's pretty extraordinary. But I think especially for Dan and Dave, it's really gratifying to be validated by your peers, certainly. But
And,
can I just add one thing?
Sure. Yeah,
So
of course.
one other great piece of mail we get is from listeners who write in and tell us they haven't had good experiences with law enforcement for whatever the reason, either personally or in a family way. And after listening to the podcast, we have at least brought them to the middle, from all cops are bad to, all right, you're human beings and you're trying to do the very best job you can. Those also are incredibly gratifying.
That is so true. And I think one of the things that Professor Murthy mentioned is that so many of the law enforcement officials who are working on these cases don't have the resources to effectively do their jobs. Clearly, in some cases, we have abuse and misconduct. I'm not referencing those individuals, but one thing that struck me after listening to your show, Small Town Dicks, was that the detectives that you speak to are so open and vulnerable about how these horrible, horrible crimes have impacted them on a mental level, on a personal level. PTSD, for example, is something that, you don't hear law enforcement openly talking about so much. Why is that important to kind of show the, the impacts of these crimes on the law enforcement officials?
I think it's so important. First of all, we're asking them to do we're asking them to do an incredibly complicated job. And we did an episode where Dan and Dave talked about all of the things that the public ask police to do, from literally my cable is out to I can't find my dog to somebody's in my house trying to break in, right? So police they're trained for a very specific set of tasks, which is make the scene safe, take the suspect, if there's a suspect, take them, again to an interview room and try to get the story. They're not there to deliver justice. They're not there to pass judgment. They're not mental health crisis negotiators, although there are negotiating teams. But again, that's to get the person out of the window back, into the room so that we can then secure the scene. So if we don't talk about the kinds of impacts that these very complex situations have on our law enforcement officers, I think we're asking them to do an extraordinary job without the kind of support that they, just as a human being, need. As we talked about, Michaela, if you are the person who every time you leave your house, you're going to encounter somebody else on their worst day, that's your job. And you're going to do that for potentially decades. Where does that live inside of you? If we don't empower them and make them feel comfortable saying, this has really affected me deeply and I need to get some support here in terms of maybe it's therapy, which is such a bad word in law enforcement for all first responders, I think we're kidding ourselves. You can't expect that much of people.
Or also just rethinking, the training that they receive in terms of, before you go out there to deal with the public, here's some basic, this is how to de-escalate a situation, let's call it, right? Just basic, we were talking earlier, joking, Dexter, who's a serial killer on TV, right? He's not real, but plays a cop who has a very smooth approach. Like he never loses his cool. He's always very chill. And I say this to my kids sometimes, not go be a serial killer, but I say, you got to be Dexter. You got to just be chill and get what you want without losing it. Because if we would approach things with this idea of de-escalation and providing more resources and support to, hopefully solving these problems before they elevate to the horrible situations that we've seen over and over, we might be in a different place, right?
Yes. Dan and Dave always say police work is a sales job. I'm trying to sell you on, let's just have a conversation about this. Like, what happened? Let's not get the, all blown out of proportion. So yes, it's a real skill.
They need to listen to Madeleine's show because, this woman can literally get anyone to tell them the full history, A to Z, bring them into the house, sit down, have a coffee. Madeleine, there's a consultancy role for you right there.
It's a superpower.
So let's talk about, though, we are dealing with real people and real tragedies. Like you said, it's for many in these cases, the worst day a family or a spouse or a partner has ever had when they have to, face these gruesome details of what's happened to a loved one. So Madeleine, in your work, I imagine you receive mail and communications from the public as well. Have you been contacted by families out there who are either, please, can you take a look at my brother, son, husband's case? There are all of these situations that are similar to the Curtis Flowers situation. Has that happened? And what do you do in terms of responding to which I can only imagine is a lot of email?
Yeah, we do get emails. We get a ton of emails, people writing to us. And yeah, the hardest ones to read are definitely the ones that are personal, that especially somebody who really doesn't have a lot of resources, who sort of like reached the end of, or people you can sort of read it and they've sort of reached the end of what their process or options might be. And at the same time, we're not criminal investigators. Like we aren't, in the business of going to investigate people's alleged wrongful convictions or something like that. Like we aren't the Innocence Project. We're investigative reporters who take a look at, go deep into like one topic. So like season 1, we went very deep into this question about whether law enforcement can solve crimes effectively, and what happens when they fail, or, season 2, what happens when a prosecutor has unchecked power, and what does that mean for, in the case of season 2, one person, Curtis Flowers, but, it's obviously a larger issue. So, we often, what we will do when we get emails that like clearly we're not going to be able to pursue, is we will try to suggest perhaps another reporter who we know might be interested in pursuing this, something like that. It's very hard for me to just sort of read an email like that and just write back, and not write back something, even though it's like not my role to fix this problem. So I do sometimes spend some time trying to find, if I'm not the right person, is there another journalist who is the right person? But, it's hard, that there's just, it doesn't like say anything great about our criminal justice system if somebody is like cold emailing a reporter to try to get somebody to like investigate why their son has been in prison for 40 years or something like that. Someone who like has not had any success getting anywhere at all with actual lawyers or the criminal justice system.
That is sad when you're the last hope, right? And you're a small team, you're in the midst of very specific work. Tell us quickly, what is the Innocence Project for anyone out there who doesn't know what that is?
For sure. So the Innocence Project is a group that exists in lots of different states in lots of different ways to represent people who they believe are actually innocent. And what they do is they represent, it's like different groups of lawyers that will come together in some cases to represent clients who they believe are innocent and try to get them out of prison. And, they've been, the Innocence Project has been very successful in doing so. And there's also, so many emails. I've read accounts of people, for all of the emails that I get as a journalist, they are nothing compared to if you're a lawyer working for the Innocence Project, how much mail you're getting from prison in this country, so they have a whole process, depends on the Innocence Project. There's different ones of how to kind of go through that stuff. And, some people, say they're innocent and they are not innocent. So, just to be clear, other people say they're innocent and there's not really a whole lot that, a lawyer can really work with. Either their cases, like the appeals where it's at is in really rough shape to try to get anywhere, or, there's just not evidence, there's not anything to sort of investigate. There's not any raw material. There's no like DNA that could be tested that could be tied to someone else. So a lot of lawyers who work in this area, because there are so many requests, have to kind of have a criteria for who gets in and who doesn't.
And so, Yeardley, tell us a little bit about your storytelling format, because I find it very interesting that you tend to keep the details of everyone involved anonymous. Tell us about the reasons why you do that.
So right out of the gate, Dan and Dave, Dan was retired when we started the podcast. Dave, still a working detective. And they felt very strongly that we, have reverence for the victims and their families. And therefore, in order not to re-traumatize these people, either the families of a survivor or of a person who had been murdered or of a survivor, that we would not actually tell you where the crime took place. We wouldn't use any last names of our detectives even. We change all the names and often sometimes the relationships of suspected victim. Again, in order to illustrate the process of the investigation without putting people in the spotlight who never asked to be put in the spotlight. So, and it's been really successful. We actually have a little clause at the beginning of our opening that says, please join us in keeping the identity of our victims private out of respect for what they've been through. And our fans, who are phenomenal, we have the best fans, have really taken that message to heart and join us for the most part in doing so. And so it's really meaningful. It's very moving to us.
And so on that note, Yeardley, I just want to hit you with a question from our audience. Someone out there would like to know, how do you decide which stories to focus on?
We say when we ask a detective to come on to the podcast, and they say like, well, what do you want me to talk about? We always say, tell us the case that you're most proud of, or one that's most memorable to you. Since we deal only it's 99% of the time, all of our cases come from small towns, hence the name, Small Town Dicks. These are cases that you haven't probably heard before, as opposed to we don't really address the big, well-known serial killer cases and stuff like that. So for our detectives, it doesn't have to be the most well-known case out of your agency. It really is the one where you had a light bulb moment, or you were like, oh my God, it was such a stroke of luck, or I can't believe that we caught this person, or I couldn't sleep at night, or I'll never forget this. All of those reasons make that case the one that they should tell.
That's so fascinating. So let's talk now for a second again about kind of this obsession that we have as women with these horrible graphic details. Now, Saturday Night Live, I don't know if either of you saw this, but they did a fun sketch on women staying home for a moment of self-care. As soon as their partner left, they put the kids to bed. The first thing they did was put on a murder show. And it just seems so, counterintuitive to like your self-care alone time was murdering, right? We have an image here that we're going to put up on screen. If you haven't seen this sketch, look it up on YouTube. It's really hysterical, but it's so true in that, so many of these shows and podcasts recount horrific details of crimes, very graphic in some cases. Madeleine, do you think that our mental health is harmed by listening to these types of details and descriptions? And, even though they're horrible, I feel like we would just want more. Like the more you get into a story, it's just kind of becomes something that you want to get to the end of.
I don't know. I mean, I think it would depend on the person. I mean, certainly some people are going to have a harder time with certain certain images or types of stories than others. I also think about, getting desensitized to things, when we, in the dark, when we talk about, what we're going to include and what we're not going to include, like something that I took away from my reporting was to really limit that. There's a person we interviewed for season 1 of In the Dark who had himself been a victim of a violent crime, who shared with us some details of that, but he talked about sharing only what he called the necessary details. And so that we really took that with us as a team. What are the necessary details that we're going to include, as somebody who makes the stories that people might engage with. And, those are the ones that you really have to know to understand the story. And if the story is something that we feel like it makes sense to make, then there will be necessary details in there. But I think that what we're always trying to do is avoid the kind of details that really make you like less engaged almost. I mean, they make it into a spectacle. It becomes like, something like there's the details that can like draw you closer in empathy to another person, but then there are the details that do the opposite, and they sort of repulse you, and you kind of, it's the equivalent of like slowing down your car when you're going past like the accident. You're not really doing that out of empathy. There's like a spectacle thing that's happening probably there. And so I don't know, I think about it more, I guess, from the perspective of someone who makes stuff, because it's your responsibility as a reporter or writer to really be giving it all that kind of thought, because if you're going to treat those details with care, then you're making a lot of choices before anybody even gets to engage with it. So you're not necessarily giving people options to engage with certain parts of the story. But that has always really stuck with me, that I really appreciated that he was setting down that boundary with us, and then like, how can we set down that boundary with listeners?
And so that's how you kind of guide your work to make sure that you're staying in the zone of journalism and investigative reporting, and not veering into, the realm of something that might be seen as exploitation and like these salacious details that, to your point, are not really necessary in terms of understanding the basics of the case.
Yeah. And we look at all of it. I mean, obviously, as reporters, we're engaged with all the details of whatever it is we're looking at. I have looked at many graphic crime scene photos, but that doesn't mean that, we just publish them or something like that.
Right. It's not like you're posting them on your Instagram.
Right.
So Madeleine, a question for you from our audience. How long does it take you to research a story? Now, Madeleine told me earlier, she's in the midst of season 3. Top secret, everybody. It's top secret. We got no details for you other than the fact that it's top secret, which makes all of us want to listen to it more. So how long does it take? Does it depend?
It really does. I mean, we were talking earlier that, one of the things on our team, so we're 5 people full time, only working on one story at a time. We are able to do something that is really, really rare. I mean, it's like why I became a journalist, but it's almost impossible to have the opportunity to just sort of spend as long as it takes to answer a question that you pose. And so, for season 1, it didn't, I think it was like a year. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure how long it was anymore, but like, it wasn't as long as season 2. Season 2, by the end of it, we spent close to, I think, 3 years total, like covering the initial investigation that we did, like a year or so, the reporting and production of it, and then following the case all the way through. And I have no idea how long this one's going to take. I mean, we formulate a question and then we report until we answer that question. So the question for season 2 was, why has Curtis Flowers been tried 6 times for the same crime? The question for season 1 was, basically, it became like, why did it take so long to solve this child abduction case? And so we're really fortunate that we get to just report until we answer the question. And that's also great too, because, the act of reporting is this really fascinating job where you just don't know where you're going to end up. And so it's really hard to honestly answer the question of like, well, how long is it going to take? It's like, I always sort of think, well, hopefully a really long time, because if it takes like just a short period of time, then maybe like all of our guesses about what was going on were correct, or like maybe, they didn't even need a reporter to look into it. But, I think the stories that tend to stick with me and are the most memorable are the ones where it's really hard. And like the truth is there someplace, but it just takes a long way to get there. And you don't even know starting out, like who are going to be the best people to talk to? How are you going to figure out what happened? You have no idea kind of where you're going. You just trust that like, if I do this thing called reporting, after some time and I stick with it, we'll get somewhere.
I want your boss. I want the boss that's like, as long as it takes, just, you know what, until you think you're done, just keep going.
I mean, it's not quite that. I want to get him.
I want to work for whoever is the one writing the checks over there at the APM. Please hire me, because I never have time to finish anything. I'm just like, okay, I'm done now. And it's like, gosh, if I would have had like 2 more hours, it would have been much better. So Yeardley, tell us on this topic, is podcasting about true crime more about storytelling, or is it more about finding the truth, or is it a combination? Someone from our audience asked that question.
Oh, it's a good question. I think that there are podcasts that are about finding the truth. So for instance, the Murder Squad does a lot of crowdsourcing. They cover cold cases. That's Paul Holes and Billy Jensen. And I think they really are hoping that those armchair sleuths can actually turn over enough new clues where they could maybe get some resolution to these cases that haven't been solved. In our case, it really was about stories. And I have this saying that I've been saying ever since we started this podcast, which is everybody has a story. Everybody thinks their story isn't that interesting, and everybody is wrong. And so I think people who a lot of times we get, which we often cut out because nobody wants to hear you say, I don't think this is very interesting. But our detectives at some point in the middle be like, I'm not sure this is really what you want. I'm like, just zip it, because it is exactly what we want. We want to know what your experience was in investigating this. What did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about people? Sort of back to your question, Michaela, about why are women so enthralled? Why do we want more murder? I do think that there is an aspect of studying how far somebody will go to cause harm to somebody else, probably somebody that they love, or equally as bad, someone they've never met. Like there's a voyeuristic quality of, how did that person cross that line? Could that ever happen to me? I mean, I think there's but for the grace of God, go I, little bit of a quality to our obsession with how did it happen? Like I remember listening to Madeleine's podcast In the Dark about Curtis Flowers, absolutely enthralled and being just gobsmacked that anybody would be tried 6 times for the same crime, B, by the same person, the same prosecutor. Like, how is that possible? How is it
It's
possible?
bananas. It's bananas, which is another podcast out there called It's
Yes,
Bananas.
it's
If you want to
true.
hear, if you want to hear a podcast about all this nonsense that goes on, it's actually true.
I've been
So
on bananas.
have you? Oh,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
awesome. So let's talk about, okay, we've talked about murder. It's horrible. We are constantly in shock. Justice system has failed us many a time. On the weekends, someone in the audience here is asking, do you need a break from murder? People want to know if you watch rom-coms. Do you only watch murder mystery? Tell us, Madeleine, I think you mentioned earlier, you're not really a true crime movie watcher.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm always looking for this sort of like low stakes things, so like we were talking earlier, the Great British Baking Show or Queer Eye or something along those lines, where you're just like, nothing terrible is going to happen on this show. Like, the worst thing that's going to happen is someone's going to have to leave the baking tent and go home to their loving friends and family. And then they'll return and they'll celebrate with everyone else, the winner very graciously of this event. I mean, I don't know. I just like to sort of zen out on that kind of low stakes drama if I'm going to watch something.
Raoul failed at the quiche. That's the level of stress I really need in this pandemic, right?
Yes.
So how about you, Yeardley? What do you like to watch when you're not talking with detectives?
Well, so I'm engaged to Detective Dan. So there's still a lot of crime going on in my world. And so when he is home, we watch a lot of true crime. There it is. I feel like I've run through the entire catalog of ID, whatever it is, Discovery.
There's nothing left to watch. I've seen them all. Like, there's none
really,
left.
kind of, sort of. When Dan isn't home, I too watch the Great British Baking Show. There's another wonderful show called Nadia Bakes. And Nadia Cook, she was actually a contestant on the Great British Baking Show. It's magic. It's on Netflix. I'll watch documentaries about the royal family. They like lighter things, as Madeline was saying. Nothing terrible is going to happen here, even though if you're the royal family, of course, they have their problems. But I'm just saying, there's still a lot of beautiful clothes. Yes. So,
I confess, I watched the Princess Diana special on CNN. I just needed to just look at some crowns and some clothes from the 80s for a break. Squid Games had me down. I was like, I need a little palate cleanser here, you guys. Like, just give me the princess back in the glory days when people used hairspray, right?
Yes.
Okay.
She was so magical. She is such. I was a huge Princess Diana fan. So yes, if there's a special about her on, I'm gonna watch it.
It's worth it. It was very, and even that one, I feel like there's probably already is a Diana podcast, but that one had a whole other like backstory of what was going on behind the scenes that we didn't know about. Goodness.
That's right.
So back to murder here for a second. Our audience would like to know, Madeleine, from you, how you mentioned that it's sad that someone would have to come to a podcast host for help, as a last resort. Do you think this is because law enforcement is not helping, or perhaps because a podcast is a less intimidating place to turn for help?
I mean, I think sometimes it's because law enforcement is hurting. I mean, if someone's been wrongfully convicted or, maybe at least potentially wrongfully convicted, they're not going to be able to go to the cops for help. I mean, that's why they are where they are, perhaps. But I don't know. I mean, I think like, I guess that's what I would say. I mean, I think that people can, we kind of take for granted sometimes, like knowing resources, like knowing that like, oh, I would call the Innocence Project, that would be a thing that I would know about. And some people just don't know about that, or they just decide at a certain point to try to challenge something again. I mean, I think about, people who've been in prison for long periods of time who turn out to have been innocent. There are people that will go through and talk about going through decades maybe where they didn't really do anything about their case. And sort of just thinking about like the psychology of that and sort of how do you cope with this like life sentence or death sentence in those cases. And so maybe you just wait to a certain point until you reach out again. One of the things that was just interesting about Curtis's situation is that he still maintained so many ties to people outside of prison. I mean, he was very close with his family. They visited him. They never missed, or almost never missed a visiting session at Parchman Prison, which like almost nobody goes to visit anyone at Parchman Prison. And yet his parents drove there every chance that they had. So I think too, there's sometimes people who kind of come into people's lives who connect them, whether it's, someone who's in prison wrongfully convicted or just someone who realizes that they could contact a reporter. But I also do think, that journalism can serve a role, and it does make sense for people to contact reporters about certain things. I mean, I do think that, like in the case of Curtis Flowers, we don't have an allegiance to anybody in this story. Like we're not Curtis's lawyers. We're not the prosecution. We're not the cops. And so, we could find out some stuff, I think, because of that, like we could say, I literally said to people, I don't care what the truth ends up being. I just want to know what it is. Like, I don't need it to be this and I don't need it to be that. Like, I can't subpoena you. I can't force you into a courtroom. Like, I have no power in this at all. I just want to know. And I'm uniquely positioned to get that information and not to, judge it incorrectly. So I think that there are times where, reporters can really do something that lawyers can't and can make people feel more comfortable, versus like an investigator from law enforcement or from the defense knocking on your door. It's intimidating, I think.
For sure. And I think probably too, just like you watch a show and you think in a weird way that you're like, oh, these are my friends. I'm going to turn on my friends here who live in, the White Lotus Hotel, and I'm going to see what they're up to. But after you listen to hours and hours of a podcaster, you kind of start to feel like you're familiar and you know them and you develop this rapport, even though they've never met you. In your head, you're like, oh, they're my friends. And so I feel like people might just feel more inclined to reach out and communicate with folks like you because you're so wonderful to listen to. So tell us, Yeardley, has there been a case that's stuck with you that you just can't get out of your head that maybe haunts you or really kind of changed you in some way?
Yes, there is. There are a couple. So there's a case, it's actually in our first season, I think it's our third episode, and it's called Unspeakable. And interestingly, and it's about child abuse. It's just the most horrific case of child abuse. So bad that the law in the state where it happened was actually changed about the kind of, when, for instance, a police officer is called to do a welfare check on a child, you actually have to check certain benchmarks in checking the child. You can't just sort of stand across the room and go, oh, well, it looks okay, standing up. That one, and people, we get mail, actually, people saying, oh my God, I love your podcast, everything about it is so fantastic, except episode 3. I started to listen to that and I was like, nope. And especially if you have children, parents don't listen to that episode, and I totally get it. But it is on the extreme end of horrible things people will do to people, especially children. It is absolutely, I'll never forget hearing that story for the first time. There's another episode we did, which is actually a 2-parter, and it's not from the point of view of detective. It's from the point of view of the man who committed the crime, and it's called Crime and Punishment. And it's fascinating. He was convicted of and admits that he executed a man when he was 14, and he went to prison for it. And now he's out. And we had a conversation with him, and it's fascinating. It's just fascinating.
Wow. All right. Well, there's your Halloween homework, everybody. If you want, 2 juicy stories to dive into, those are a couple. And then, of course, watch Great British Baking Show to like bring you back down to joy and humanity of baked goods with sugar, right?
Yes. Yes.
We all need a little baking show. So we're almost out of time, but I want to let everyone know that if you've missed any of our past shows and you want to catch up, visit scarymommy.com/live-work-thrive, where you can find all our past episodes. And while you're there, you can sign up for our next live event, which will be November 16th. And we will be talking about raising independent tweens and teens. I have 2 of them at home. Believe me, this is no joke. Okay, you think murder is intense? Try a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old who don't wear deodorant. Okay, this is where it really gets ugly. Right, people? I'm telling you, it's not easy. There's so many baby books, no books about the teenagers, right? There's like maybe 2 out there. Anyway, thank you so much to our incredible panelists. I feel like we could have talked a whole other hour about all of these things because there's so many interesting, fascinating details about the genre. So Madeleine Baran, check out In the Dark from APM reports the next season is in the works. She doesn't know when it's going to be done because she's got to take the time. Thorough investigative journalism doesn't have a time clock, right? But it's coming out. It's coming out. It's going to be juicy because it's top secret. And also Yeardley Smith, thank you so much. Check out season 9 of Small Town Dicks, wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can catch Yeardley's voice on The Simpsons. And I think, isn't there a fun fact that Marge and Lisa got obsessed with true crime on one of the episodes? And you came on as yourself?
Yes. It's called Podcast News. And it's a great, really funny, meta episode. It was really, really fun.
How cool is that?
Yeah.
How cool is it? You're honored to play yourself, but meanwhile, you're like already a legend for playing the voice. I mean, this is crazy. I love it. Well, thank you both. And you're both very busy. Thank you for all the work that you do, because I do think it's important, both with different perspectives and ways of looking at these stories. So thank you. Have a great night, everyone out there watching. If you love true crime, go forth, listen to horrible stories, decode the next serial killer before he strikes, and seek out the stories that uplift underrepresented voices of both the storytellers and the victims. And then take my own personal murder prevention advice I'm going to offer you. Don't let your drunk friend go home by herself. Stay out of the forest, just in general at night, good policy, and get a large dog. I got a large dog. I'm never getting murdered. All right. Words to live by in order to survive the patriarchy and live, work, and thrive. Good night, everyone.